10. Joshua Michael Rosebush. While approaching a pickup truck during a routine traffic stop in Saginaw County, Michigan in 2019, Officer Jeff Koenig was shot in the face and shoulder. At the time, Koenig was pulling over the driver for having his headlights off at 2 a.m. But he didn't realize that the truck was stolen or that it was being driven by a parolee who was at large for skipping out on his parole. Koenig's plan was to tell the driver to turn his lights on and continue with his shift. He had no reason to suspect that the man behind the wheel of the pickup truck was going to turn violent. But before Koenig could engage in any meaningful conversation, the driver pointed a stolen .380 caliber pistol at him, said "nighty-night," and then pulled the trigger. The suspect, 29-year-old Joshua Michael Rosebush, fled the scene. Luckily though, he was taken into custody after a shootout with police. Officer Koenig survived after taking 2 bullets at point-blank range, and thankfully no other cops were injured. Rosebush, who was on parole at the time of his arrest, already had a long list of felony convictions under his belt. He took a bullet to the jaw during the shootout, but he survived and was charged with a variety of crimes. 19 days earlier, Rosebush had cut off 2 ankle bracelets, one that monitored his location and another that detected alcohol consumption. A jury found Rosebush guilty of 26 counts, including assault with intent to murder, assault with intent to do great bodily harm, 13 felony firearm counts, 5 counts of being a felon in possession of a firearm, and 3 counts of unlawfully driving away a motor vehicle. He also received 1 count each of assaulting, resisting, or obstructing police, receiving and concealing of a stolen firearm, and carrying a dangerous weapon with unlawful intent. And as a result, Rosebush was sentenced to at least 75 years in prison, with an earliest possible release date of November 2096. 9. Heath Lloyd. In 2016, a 41-year-old Florida man named Heath Lloyd fatally shot his pregnant ex-girlfriend, 24-year-old Say Dixon, at her parents' home in Pine Hills, Florida. Dixon had recently moved in with her family after getting into a fight with Lloyd that turned violent. Lloyd remained at large for nearly a month before being spotted at a Walmart store in Orlando in early 2017. When Police Master Sergeant Deborah Clayton tried to apprehend him, he shot her and fled the scene. And sadly, Clayton died from her injuries at a nearby hospital. The pursuit continued as Lloyd shot at another officer's vehicle and carjacked a civilian. And while searching for Lloyd on a motorcycle, Deputy Norman Lewis was fatally struck by a van. Lloyd managed to stay far enough ahead of law enforcement to once again slip through their grasp, sparking a 9-day manhunt. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to his capture, while SWAT teams and police units searched through neighborhoods, houses, and apartment buildings. In addition to searching for Lloyd, authorities arrested his former boss, his niece, and an ex-girlfriend for allegedly helping the double murderer run from the law. After searching more than 100 houses and expanding the manhunt into neighboring Polk County, law enforcement finally captured Lloyd at a house in Carver Shores. As officers surrounded the house, Lloyd finally decided to surrender. He allegedly threw 2 guns onto the ground and began belly crawling toward the police. By then, officers had received tips claiming that Lloyd had said he'd rather die than go back to prison. So, it was no surprise when things got violent while police attempted to take him into custody, with several officers delivering multiple muzzle strikes, kicks, and punches to Lloyd. He lost his left eye as a result of his injuries, and some felt that the police used excessive force. However, State Attorney Phil Archer ruled that the use of force was justified. Lloyd was convicted of 3 murders and was sentenced to death, but he's since appealed his case and is trying to get a new trial. 8. Matthew Rial. It was around 3 a.m. on New Year's Eve in 2017 when 911 dispatchers in Douglas County, Colorado received their first call from 37-year-old Matthew Rial. A disagreement between Rial and his roommate had allegedly gotten violent, and Rial was accusing his roommate of attacking him. But after noticing that the address was flagged as the residence of a man with PTSD who might have access to weapons, deputies took a cautious approach. When they arrived though, it seemed like things had calmed down. Rial's roommate Matthew Thompson told a responding deputy that Rial didn't have any mental disabilities or drug habits that he knew of, and he didn't know why Rial was so upset. Thompson was cooperative, but Rial got into an argument with the deputy because he was refusing to hand over his ID. During the disagreement, Rial began to loudly yell that he was being assaulted, even though body cam footage showed that the officers weren't hurting him in the slightest. In fact, their main goal was to de-escalate the situation. Deputy Zachary Parrish managed to calm Rial down, and after determining that no crimes had been committed, law enforcement left the scene. But then, 2 hours later, just after 5 a.m., Rial dialed 911 again. His tone this time was noticeably irate compared to earlier, and he wasn't making much sense. So Deputy Parrish and his fellow officers returned to the residence, where Rial initially opened the door but suddenly slammed it in their faces. He then began yelling through the door, and it was clear based on his behavior that he was in a mentally unstable state. Law enforcement decided that it would be appropriate to take Rial into custody on a mental health hold, which meant that he'd be evaluated at a psychiatric emergency room. But as they made a coordinated entry into the apartment, they quickly discovered that Rial had trashed the place in a suspected attempt to make the officers' entry difficult. He was later found barricaded in a bedroom, and he refused to come out. Left with no other option, Parrish and his fellow deputy Taylor Davis kicked in the door. But on the other side, Rial was waiting with a loaded AR-15. He immediately began shooting at the deputies, firing an estimated 30 rounds in just a handful of seconds. Parrish was then struck by the gunfire, which forced him to collapse on the ground. As 2 members of the team began pulling Parrish across the floor in an attempt to get him out of the apartment, Rial began shooting again. Deputies Jeff Pell and Michael Doyle were struck, and as the bullets continued to fly, they were forced to retreat from the scene. Meanwhile, Deputy Taylor Davis took cover in the roommate's bedroom, and knowing she was unlikely to survive if she stayed in the apartment, she jumped out of the window. She was hit by a bullet during her escape, but managed to reach the growing number of law enforcement officers from various agencies who were gathering around the building. At this point, Parrish was still in the apartment. Knowing the time was of the essence, a SWAT team attempted to make entry, but every time they approached, Rial sprayed bullets in their directions. Then, after shooting at the police for an hour and a half, Rial was killed by returned gunfire. Unfortunately, by then it was too late to save Parrish, but the other officers who were shot survived their injuries. Investigators found 11 guns in Rial's room, which explains how he was able to shoot nearly 400 rounds at law enforcement. His motive for committing these senseless acts of violence is unclear, but he had a long history of mental illness. The tragedy prompted lawmakers to propose a new law that would make it easier to temporarily revoke guns from mentally unstable individuals. But in a heavily pro-gun state, gaining support for the policy proved difficult, and the bill failed to pass in the state legislature. 7. William Paul Jones. 22-year-old Christopher Neal had just moved into his new home in Comstock Township, Michigan with his wife and young child, when he came face to face with an armed intruder in 2019. Neal dialed 911 while his wife and daughter hid upstairs, and during the call, the dispatcher could hear the suspect William Paul Jones reassuring Neal that he wasn't going to hurt him. The dispatcher immediately began trying to reason with Jones, asking if it at least let the family leave the house, but he refused, and it quickly turned into a hostage situation, prompting a multi-agency response. Kalamazoo deputies and a Michigan state trooper entered the home to find that Jones had barricaded himself and Neal inside a first-floor bedroom. Law enforcement tried desperately to reason with Jones, who shouted back and forth with them through the door. At that point, the number one goal was to convince Jones to release Neal, who yelled through the door to confirm that he was still alive. But Jones's behavior became increasingly erratic and agitated, and at one point, Neal could be heard yelling that the suspect was on top of him. When gunfire broke out, it was clear that the situation wasn't going to end peacefully. 3 officers were struck by bullets before the shooting stopped. And by the time police entered the bedroom, Jones had escaped through a window, and Neal was dead from a gunshot wound to the back of the head. Law enforcement took it heavy when they realized that they'd failed to rescue the hostage they were so intent on saving. Their main focus turned toward capturing Jones before any more lives were lost, and luckily he was captured shortly after fleeing from the home. Jones was convicted of 18 felonies including first-degree murder, assault with intent to murder, breaking and entering resulting in murder, and more. The murder conviction alone carries a mandatory life sentence, which thankfully means that Jones will never step foot in the free world again. 6. Yvette Lares Garcia. During a routine traffic stop in Clackamas County, Oregon in November 2021, Gladstone officer Clement Lamb discovered that 37-year-old Yvette Lares Garcia was wanted on a theft warrant out of Texas. The state of Texas was willing to extradite Garcia, which meant that it was mandatory to arrest her. Garcia was cooperative and polite throughout the arrest, but she repeatedly mentioned how her dogs were at home and she had nobody to care for them. So, with no other option but to have the dogs taken to a shelter while Garcia dealt with her legal issues, the police took her to her apartment so she could help put them in leashes. They were able to leash one of the dogs right away, but the other one ran upstairs. Garcia and Sergeant Travis Hill went after the dog, while Lau stayed downstairs with the already leashed pooch. The suspect was handcuffed behind her back, but she managed to grab a gun from somewhere in the room while Hill tried coaxing the dog over to him. And as they made their way downstairs, Garcia shot Hill in the arm and leg. With Sergeant Hill collapsed on the floor, Lau sprang into action and returned fire at Garcia. He struck her in the torso and ordered her to drop her weapon, but she blatantly refused several times, saying that she wasn't going back to jail. Even after being struck multiple times in the torso, Garcia still refused to drop the gun and continued to shoot. Luckily though, she was finally taken into custody with the help from backup officers. The effects of Garcia's actions were permanent to Sergeant Hill, who suffered permanent injuries that forced him into retirement. As it turned out, Garcia was accused of embezzling over $1 million in Texas and was facing potential prison time. But her attempts to avoid facing the warrant only landed her even more time behind bars. She received a 10-year sentence for attempted aggravated murder, the maximum allowable under state law, and will be extradited to Texas to be tried on the embezzlement case after serving her time in Oregon. 5. James Ramirez. After being robbed at gunpoint in broad daylight one morning in 2021, a teenager met with a police officer in an Albuquerque parking lot to report the crime. The thieves made off with the young man's PlayStation 4, his wallet, and a gold chain. And during his conversation with Officer Mario Verbeck, the victim spotted the suspects across the street. Verbeck and another officer, James Eichel, chased after the suspects on foot. But during the pursuit, a young man later identified as 28-year-old James Ramirez shot at the officers. Both Verbeck and Eichel were hit, and after realizing that Verbeck wasn't capable of getting up and was in desperate need of emergency care, Eichel went to get help. After seeing the shooting from his home, a nearby resident named Johnny Garcia waited for the gunfire to stop. Then, he went outside and helped Officer Verbeck walk out to the street, where they were met with paramedics. Meanwhile, the gunman ran into a nearby parking lot, where he exchanged gunfire with Officer Harry Gunderson and Lieutenant Sean Kenny, and unfortunately both officers were struck by bullets. Ramirez refused orders to put the gun down and continued shooting, even after being shot by the police. He finally stopped though when he couldn't stand the pain of his injuries and was taken into custody once backup arrived. All 4 officers who were shot survived, and Ramirez went on to recover from his gunshot wounds to the chest, thigh, leg, and arm. He was charged with both federal and state crimes, but then he suddenly died in custody while awaiting trial, and the cause of his death remains undetermined. After spending his 30th wedding anniversary in the hospital, Officer Verbeck and his wife made up for it by renewing their vows. It only felt right to ask the man who saved his life, Johnny Garcia, to be his best man, and Garcia was honored to accept the offer. 4. John Terry Chapman Jr. While conducting routine patrol one day in July of 2018, police officers in Tulsa, Oklahoma, had a brief conversation with a man and a woman who were sitting in a minivan in a parking lot. A man in the driver's seat, later identified as 34-year-old John Terry Chapman Jr., politely declined to provide his name or ID when asked. And at that point, there was no reason to suspect the couple of any crimes, so they had every right not to engage with the officers if they didn't want to. But after going back to his car, one of the cops ran the minivan's license plate and discovered that it belonged to a different vehicle. Officers then caught up with the couple at a nearby Quick Trip gas station. The woman willingly handed over her ID, but Chapman refused. He accused the officers of lacking the proper jurisdiction to arrest him and demanded that they call their superiors, which they said they'd do if he'd cooperate. But he refused to exit the van at the officer's command, prompting Sergeant Mike Parsons to threaten to fire a pepper ball into the vehicle. And when it became clear that Chapman had no plans to comply with law enforcement, Parsons fired the pepper ball gun. Pepper ball is like a powder form of pepper spray. Like mace, it serves as a non-lethal means of disabling a suspect. But when the pepper ball was deployed inside the minivan, Chapman fired a gun at the cops, striking Parsons in the leg. Parsons was in a lot of pain, but he was strangely capable of continuing to work the scene. He wasn't experiencing the type of blood loss that normally occurs from a gunshot wound to the thigh, and he didn't appear to be going into shock. Knowing that Chapman was dangerous and needed to be apprehended as soon as possible, Parsons pushed past the pain and focused on the task at hand. An officer had returned fire when Chapman shot Parsons, but the suspect was still moving around in the minivan, making it unclear whether he'd been hit. And it looked as though he might be reaching for another gun. After carefully calculating their next move, the officers swiftly removed Chapman from the van and took him into custody. Chapman was shot during the altercation, but he survived. As paramedics cut Parsons' pants off to assess his bullet wound in the back of an ambulance, a coin fell out of his pocket. It was a US Navy challenge coin that his friend and fellow officer Con Erickson had given to him as a symbol of their close friendship. And it very well may have saved Parsons' life. If the coin hadn't absorbed most of the bullet's impact, the likelihood of striking a major artery or sustaining a far more damaging injury would have been much higher. Chapman was tried in both state and federal court for his crimes. And in 2019, he was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. The conviction was overturned based on a discrepancy regarding Chapman's intent, but he remains behind bars in Oklahoma, where he's currently serving a 105-year sentence. 3. Joel Young. In February 2010, 911 dispatchers in Whatcom County, Washington were flooded with calls about gunshots being fired in a normally quiet subdivision. According to callers, a drunk man was threatening his neighbor with a shotgun and firing warning shots into the air. Responding deputies spoke with the target of the threats, who said that he was having a fire in his backyard when the smoke upset his neighbor, 60-year-old Joel Young. The man said he didn't take Young's threats very seriously, but he also put the fire out to avoid escalating the situation. When the deputies asked Young to come outside without his gun and talk to them, he basically told them to get lost. A third household also said that they'd been threatened by Young on more than one occasion, including that same day. At some point, Young came outside, saw deputies crouching near his garage, and then went back into his home. However, he came back out a little while later with a gun and fired at one deputy, striking him in the head. Another deputy returned fire, but sadly he was also shot in the head. Amazingly, Ryan Rathbun and Jason Thompson both survived and even continued to work the scene while they waited for backup and emergency medical responders. But they were injured and losing blood fast, and they needed treatment as soon as possible. A civilian rushed over with his own handgun and emptied the entire clip in the direction of Young's house. Several armed neighbors also came to the scene and stayed there until backup arrived, ready to fire if the need arose. They also rendered first aid to Rathbun and Thompson, whose conditions were worsening as the minutes passed. Young eventually surrendered and was booked on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 6 counts of reckless endangerment, and first-degree assault while armed with a firearm. He already received charges of second-degree assault while armed with a firearm and felony harassment. He pleaded not guilty and remains behind bars on $5 million bail while he awaits trial. Deputy Rathbun lost almost all vision in his left eye and has undergone more than a half-dozen surgeries. Deputy Thompson sustained a brain injury and now struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder. And both men were out of work for about a year before returning to the force full-time. 2. Tyron Lamb. After seeing a car blow through a red light one evening in 2021, a police officer in Greenfield, Wisconsin tried to perform a traffic stop. The driver, 31-year-old Tyron Lamb, refused to pull over. A high-speed chase ensued, and spike strips failed to disable the vehicle. The pursuit came to an end, though, when the car collided with a pickup truck at an intersection. Officers couldn't see into the car very well because the airbags had been deployed. But as they repeatedly ordered Lamb to show his hands, he instead grabbed a gun and fired multiple shots through the windshield. Lamb continued shooting as he climbed out of the car, striking Officer Adam Franco in the hand, chest and thigh before fleeing the scene on foot. Harrowing body cam footage showed Officer Franco begging a fellow officer not to let him die as she rendered first aid. He was then rushed to the hospital in critical condition and thankfully survived. Police caught up with Lamb near the scene of the crash. He continued firing at officers, leaving them with no choice but to shoot back. And as a consequence for his actions, Lamb was killed in the exchange of gunfire. At the time of his death, the suspect was on probation after serving prison time for 2 separate convictions of attempting to flee or elude law enforcement. He also had a prior conviction for armed robbery. After being released from his most recent prison stint in 2020, Lamb took a job renovating homes. He was a father of 2 with a 3rd child on the way. It's unclear why he didn't cooperate with the traffic stop, but his decision to shoot at the cops cost him his life, which was worse than any other consequence he would have suffered, even if he was breaking the law when he got pulled over. We have another great video lined up right after number 1. If you need more of a daily wordless dosage, then be sure to stay tuned if you haven't seen that one yet. 1. John Winston Borgman. During the pre-dawn hours one day in 2023, 911 dispatchers in Yakima County, Washington received a hang-up call from someone who could be heard arguing with their spouse before the line disconnected. After tracing the call, a dispatcher reached out and spoke with someone at the house, who said that a man named John Winston Borgman was there and that he was assaulting his wife. Deputies responded to the scene at 1 a.m. and spoke with Borgman's wife outside the house. She and another witness said that Borgman had mental health and drug issues, and the wife requested a police escort into the home so she could grab some belongings and leave with her children. Deputies Andrew Wilkinson and Travis Watkins accompanied the woman to the entrance of the home, but when she opened the door, Borgman was allegedly standing there with a military-style semi-automatic rifle. And, according to court documents, a deputy ordered Borgman to drop the weapon, but he fired at the cops instead. As Deputy Wilkinson went to his vehicle to retrieve his own rifle, the suspect fired 6 more rounds, striking Deputy Watkins in the forearm, hand, and abdomen. Wilkinson put his injured colleague into his patrol car and rushed him to a nearby fire station, where he received first aid before being taken to the hospital. In the meantime, Borgman went outside and interacted with other responding deputies using the radio in Watkins' vehicle, and surprisingly, he cooperated with their orders to surrender. Borgman faces 1 count of second-degree assault related to domestic violence and 2 counts of first-degree assault. Police also seized more than 20 guns from his house. The suspect had previously lost his right to own a gun due to a conviction for second-degree robbery in 2009. But his right to own a firearm was restored in 2017. During his preliminary hearing, Borgman reportedly tried to waive his right to an attorney, claiming that he could do a better job defending himself. He was muted several times throughout the proceeding, which took place on Zoom, and eventually he agreed to accept a public defender. The case is ongoing though, so Borgman has yet to receive his sentencing. 12. Nancy Gonzalez. While working third shift at a federal prison in New York City in 2012, Corrections officer Nancy Gonzalez began a hot and heavy affair with convicted death row comp killer Rial Wilson. The pair snuck off to a nearby activity room for late-night action multiple times over a several-month period before informants reported the illicit relationship to authorities. According to jailhouse snitches, Gonzalez concocted a scheme to get pregnant by Wilson in hopes that becoming a father would garner enough sympathy to get him off death row. And her timing couldn't have been better, because when the pair conceived, Wilson was facing a new sentencing hearing amid a years-long court battle to spare his life. The fling ended when Wilson was moved to solitary confinement without explanation. In a recorded conversation with her new boyfriend, who was also incarcerated, Gonzalez admitted that Wilson was the father of her baby. Under the law, prisoners are considered incapable of consenting to physical relations. But Gonzalez depicted herself as the real victim, saying she got sucked into Wilson's world and describing herself as vulnerable and wanting to be loved. However, during questioning, she reportedly confessed to getting pregnant on purpose. Authorities charged Gonzalez with abusing a person in custody, and shortly after giving birth to a son, she lost parental rights for driving drunk with the baby in the car. During her court proceedings, her lawyer blamed trauma for Gonzalez's poor decisions, which included intimate encounters with at least 8 fellow guards during the last 2 years she worked at the prison. Meanwhile, the disgraced former corrections officer's last-ditch effort to spare Wilson's life failed, and he was sentenced to death for a second time at his resentencing hearing. Gonzalez pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a year and 1 day in federal prison. And just weeks after Gonzalez's arrest, another corrections officer from New York State made news headlines for shockingly similar reasons. 39-year-old Tyron Lamb Brewster was reportedly 6 months pregnant by an inmate at a state correctional facility when she got busted for the forbidden tryst. The prisoner was relocated and Brewster lost her job and faced criminal charges, but unfortunately, the outcome of the case is unclear. 11. Jesse Dobbs. During the pre-dawn hours one day in November 2016, a Baytown, Texas resident overheard gunshots but didn't call the police. Several hours later, officers performed a welfare check at the home of 37-year-old Cynthia Morris at the request of her concerned co-workers. When they entered the house, they found Morris and one of her daughters, Brianna Pavlicek, dead with gunshot wounds in the master bedroom. Law enforcement issued an alert for Morris's other daughter, Kirsten Fritsch, who had vanished with her boyfriend, 21-year-old Jesse Dobbs, in the family's car. Someone spotted the couple that morning, but investigators failed to catch up with them until hours later, when the mother of Dobbs' children told authorities that Dobbs had called her and asked to see his kids. Police traced the phone number to a Texas City nightclub called Shenanigans, where they found the young man wet and shoeless. They picked him up on a resisting arrest charge and questioned him on Kirsten's whereabouts. Dobbs reportedly confessed to killing his girlfriend, stating that he killed not the real Kirsten, but the fake Kirsten. He then refused to disclose the location of her body. Kirsten's remains were found behind Shenanigans following a 2-day search. She'd been stabbed more than 50 times in the face, neck, and torso, and was also covered in defensive wounds, showing just how hard she fought for her life during her final moments. Authorities charged Dobbs with Kirsten's murder. He pleaded guilty but argued in court that he acted with sudden passion. Under Texas law, this means that a crime was committed in the heat of the moment, and that the killer didn't plan the crime but acted out of sudden emotion. The jury rejected Dobbs' sudden passion claim though, and they sentenced him to 45 years in prison. He's required to serve at least half his sentence before becoming eligible for parole. Dobbs was never charged with the murders of Kirsten's mum and sister, but he remains the prime suspect in the case. 10. Craig Becker. Joanna Hove Becker moved from Sweden to the United States with her parents in 1999 at the age of 6 and grew up to become a psychologist and military wife. In 2013, she moved to Mons, Belgium with her husband, Navy Lieutenant Craig Becker, who was assigned to a NATO post in the country. The couple then went on to have a daughter the following year. In October 2015, police responded to reports of a woman falling or jumping out of a 7th-story window at the Becker's apartment building, and they arrived to find 32-year-old Joanna lying dead on the pavement in a pool of her own blood. Craig told investigators that his wife struggled deeply with addiction and mental illness. Authorities initially ruled that she'd taken her own life, but they reclassified her death as a homicide after an autopsy found high levels of drugs in her system that would have rendered her unconscious. With the amount of medication in Joanna's body, she wouldn't have been able to climb out the window, much less stand up on her own. And a closer look at her injuries and other evidence further pointed toward foul play. Joanna's family insisted that she'd have never willingly abandoned her daughter, and her friends didn't notice anything unusual about her behavior, although like any other person she had some problems in her life. Her marriage to Craig had deteriorated after their daughter's birth, and the couple had separated about a month before Joanna's death. 2 years earlier, she'd accused Craig of hitting and choking her after finding a text message from another man in her phone. But she recanted her criminal complaint against him and the case was dropped. Joanna's friends and family later told police that she feared what Craig might do to her if his career were damaged. After Joanna's death, authorities arrested Craig on suspicion of murder. He languished in Belgian custody for the next 2 years until the US Navy finally became willing to prosecute the case. Craig adamantly maintained his innocence and seemed eager to get the court proceedings over with so he could clear his name and go back to living a normal life, but that never happened. According to court documents, he became enraged after learning that Joanna was seeing a new boyfriend. At the time, she'd just paid a deposit on her own place and was about to move out of the home she and Craig shared. Shortly after discovering Joanna's new relationship, Craig drugged her wine with a powerful cocktail of sedatives and painkillers, including a surgical-grade anesthesia drug called midazolam. After rendering his estranged wife unconscious, he sent her plummeting to the pavement 7 stories below. Craig was also accused of impersonating Joanna by using her phone to send text messages to himself, making it appear as though she was interested in reconciling. Craig didn't erupt into the type of frenzied rage typically associated with a crime of passion. In fact, it was evident that he planned the murder. However, he acted on short notice after slowly boiling over with fury toward Joanna and reaching a point of no return with his anger. In the end, he was found guilty of assault, conduct unbecoming of an officer and a gentleman, and murder. And as a result, the court sentenced Craig Becker to life in prison without parole. 9. Taikwon Long. 36-year-old New York City resident Joan Gravette was shot multiple times in broad daylight and was left for dead in 2016 at the hands of her jealous ex-boyfriend 29-year-old Taikwon Long. The fatal shooting happened in the hallway of Gravette's apartment building in Far Rockaway, Queens. Taikwon went on the deadly rampage after becoming suspicious that the victim had cheated on him with her neighbor. The relationship had recently ended, and Joanne had obtained a restraining order against Taikwon, but a piece of paper wasn't enough to keep him away. After gunning Joanne down in cold blood, Taikwon continued to pull the trigger repeatedly as he followed Barbara Romano, the mother of the man he thought Joanne was cheating with, into the building's lobby. Barbara was shot in the hand as she ducked for cover behind a security desk and crawled to a nearby boiler room where she dialed 911. Luckily, she survived her injuries. Joanne's neighbors and relatives described the victim's 5-year relationship with Taikwon as rocky. They said Taikwon had a history of being violent and threatening toward Joanne, and that his anger issues had recently worsened due to his drug use. And just a few months before Joanne's murder, he was charged with assault for allegedly throwing a shoe at her and hitting her with a lamp. On the day of the shooting, Taikwon called Joanne's neighbor Johnny Kelly, the man he thought she was cheating with, and left multiple threatening voicemails stating that there would be bloodshed if Johnny didn't give him money. He also allegedly charged Johnny in a subway station with a crazed look in his eyes just minutes before he opened fire on Joanne. Johnny later told the New York Times that he begged Joanne to come into his apartment where she could be safe from Taikwon, but she didn't seem to think she was in serious danger and insisted on staying at home. The scorned shooter fled the crime scene and remained on the run for over a month before being captured in Sacramento. He was then extradited to New York on suspicion of murder, attempted murder, and other charges. And in the end, a jury convicted Taikwon of all counts, and he was sentenced to 45 years to life in prison. 8. Nicholas Holbert. While stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 23-year-old U.S. Army medic Kelly Bordeaux became a regular at a bar called Froggy Bottoms in North Fayetteville. On what began as a typical Friday night in April 2012, she headed to her watering hole, ready to cut loose after a long and stressful work week. Kelly didn't drink enough to get drunk, but she made sure she had a designated driver anyway. But shortly after midnight, she left Froggy Bottoms with her DD, Nicholas Holbert, and was never seen or heard from again. In Kelly's mind, she and Nicholas were platonic friends. She thought of him as a drinking buddy, and nothing more. And with an estranged husband she was thinking about divorcing and a new long-distance boyfriend named Justin Thompson in the picture, her plate was full as far as relationships went. At the time, Thompson was living in Florida. He'd met Nicholas Holbert during a previous visit to see Kelly and had gotten creepy vibes from him. Thompson was upset when he learned that Kelly was relying on Holbert for a ride home. Not because he thought she might cheat, but because he was worried for her safety. Helpless to protect Kelly from hundreds of miles away, Thompson urged her to take pepper spray. But unfortunately, she brushed off his concerns. Holbert was a drifter who worked at the bar part-time and lived in the forest behind it. Following Kelly's disappearance, he told police he dropped her off outside her apartment and had no idea where she went after that. Law enforcement didn't believe him, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, especially since Kelly was merely a missing person at that point and it was unclear whether any crimes had been committed. Holbert maintained his innocence and acted worried about his missing friend. He assisted in a search for Kelly, which failed to turn up any sign of her, and even went on the news and pleaded with the public for information regarding her whereabouts. Kelly remained missing for the next 2 years, while a determined private investigator named David Marshburn turned it into his new full-time job to befriend Holbert and get him to talk. In the beginning, Marshburn focused on gaining Holbert's trust and even helped him out financially. Later on in his mission, Marshburn claimed to have police connections and said he could get Holbert a cushy plea deal, even though it wasn't true. All Holbert had to do in exchange for a promised slap on the wrist was divulge the details of what happened to Kelly and where her body was. Holbert initially took the bait, but then he got nervous and backed out at the 11th hour. So, in a last-ditch attempt to get him back on the hook, Marshburn told him he was about to be indicted for murder, which once again wasn't true. This revelation quickly got Holbert back on board with the phony plea offer and led Marshburn to Kelly's shallow grave, which wasn't far from the campsite where he lived. And in a chilling confession, Holbert admitted to killing Kelly in a jealous rage after realizing that she only saw him as a friend. As he watched her act kindly with other guys at the bar while paying little attention to him, Holbert became consumed with anger, but maintained his composure for the time being. But at some point during the night, someone warned Kelly that Holbert had prior convictions for assaulting women. She then refused to get in Holbert's vehicle after leaving the bar, so he attacked her and knocked her unconscious. And when Kelly woke up to Holbert on top of her and tried to fight him off, he bludgeoned her repeatedly in the head with a rock. He then buried Kelly's body and went back to the bar to continue drinking. After realizing he'd been duped into confessing, Holbert pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and was sentenced to life without parole. 7. Oscar Solas. While finishing his shift in Pasco County, Florida one night in April 2023, 59-year-old Uber Eats driver Randall Cook pulled over to text his wife and let her know that he'd be home soon. But he went radio silent and never came home, causing his wife to grow increasingly worried as her text messages went unanswered. After waiting several hours, she reported Cook missing to the police. Officers then obtained Cook's last known location from Uber Eats and visited the address. Surveillance footage provided by a household member at the residence showed Cook approaching the house with a delivery around the time of his disappearance. But the clip suddenly cut out right after he reached the door, at which point investigators believe Cook was yanked inside the home. Video from the next day appeared to show two people, including a man later identified as 30-year-old Oscar Solas, placing multiple garbage bags and a cooler alongside the home. And when officers looked inside the bags, they found the missing driver's dismembered remains. They also recovered Cook's wedding ring and car keys from inside the home. Solas has known ties to a faction of the notorious MS-13 gang in Indiana, as well as an extensive criminal record filled with violent convictions for past offenses. He'd recently moved to the Sunshine State after being released from prison. The 315-pound parolee, whose face is almost entirely covered in tattoos, worked as a bouncer at a strip club. Police took Solas into custody for failing to register as a felon in Pasco County and later charged him with first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. At the moment, he's being held without bail while the case proceeds in court. Describing Cook's murder as demonic and a horrific crime of passion, Pasco Sheriff Chris Nocco said that law enforcement was working diligently to identify any connections between Solas and the victim. As things currently stand, it appears as though the murder was random, and the Cook unknowingly entered the path of a raging psychopath whose actions cannot be understood by any sane person or anyone with a shred of conscience. About a month after the gruesome slaying, prosecutors announced plans to pursue the death penalty against Solas, citing the particularly horrifying and cruel nature of the unprovoked crime. 6. Brenda Lazaro. Late one night in early February 2014, police in Coppell, Texas received a 911 call from a hysterical woman who claimed that her boyfriend had shot himself in his apartment. Officers arrived to find 27-year-old Jonathan Cruz dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. The victim's girlfriend of 3 months, Brenda Lazaro, claimed that the injury was self-inflicted. Jonathan's family immediately suspected Brenda of lying. Although Jonathan had a history of depression, he hadn't shown any recent signs of being in a potentially harmful state of mind. For the most part, he seemed happy about how things were going and excited about his future. In fact, according to some of his friends and relatives, the only major problem in Jonathan's life was his relationship with Brenda. On several occasions, those closest to him had noticed troubling signs of possible jealousy and possessiveness. Speaking with Dateline in 2023, Jonathan's mother said that she had to tell her son to put his phone down during a family vacation. At the time, he'd just started dating Brenda, and they were already texting constantly. This could be a perfectly normal example of a new couple caught up in their excitement for each other, but in hindsight, it seemed like one of many red flags symbolizing an unhealthy attachment between the pair. During a double date one evening, Brenda allegedly became infuriated with Jonathan for giving his friend's wife Emily a friendly hug. Her anger over Jonathan and Emily's platonic friendship only grew with time, according to Jonathan's sister Danny Cruz, who told Dateline that her brother ended the relationship over Brenda's controlling ways the day before his death. The family's suspicions were heightened when Brenda failed to attend Jonathan's funeral. To this day, they believe that Jonathan broke up with Brenda and that she showed up at his apartment to try persuading him to continue the relationship. According to their theory, an argument broke out and Brenda shot Jonathan in a fit of anger when she didn't get her way. Brenda maintained her innocence and claimed she was a welcome guest at Jonathan's apartment. She was never arrested or charged in connection with the case, and Jonathan's manner of death remains undetermined. Some investigators allege that the forensics can't rule out an accident or self-inflicted wound, while others claim that based on the evidence, it would have been impossible for Jonathan to be responsible for what happened to him. His family spent years urging the authorities to continue treating the incident as a possible homicide, but they chose not to. The case is inactive and, for all intents and purposes, classified as an unfortunate tragedy. In the absence of a criminal case against Brenda, The Cruz family pursued justice in civil court via a wrongful death lawsuit, which went to trial in 2022. A jury awarded them $206 million in damages, which they know they'll likely never see, but they made it clear long ago that the principle of the matter is more important than the money. Brenda has since gone married and is now a mother of 2. And while she's innocent in the eyes of the law, some people remain convinced that she got away with murder. 5. Gibson Pool. Breakups are understandably upsetting, but 29-year-old Gibson Pool took his reaction to a whole new level on Valentine's Day in 2011 after learning that his girlfriend, Tomika Peterson, was planning to leave him. Tomika was going to change the locks on her home in Riviera Beach, Florida, but never got the chance before Gibson uncovered her plan. As she tried to leave the residence with some friends, Gibson approached her car and repeatedly asked Tomika if she was leaving him. When she didn't answer to his satisfaction, he opened fire on the vehicle, striking Tomika and one of her friends. Another friend jumped into the driver's seat and rushed to the nearest hospital, but sadly, Tomika died from her injuries. Gibson then fled the state and immediately became the subject of a federal manhunt. After allegedly threatening to kill any cop who tried to arrest him and saying that he'd not be taken alive, authorities were especially determined to capture him before he could harm anyone else. Fortunately, Gibson made it easy for law enforcement to locate him by leaving his cell phone on while in hiding. Police tracked him to a motel 800 miles from the crime scene in Kingsport, Tennessee, where his van was found sitting right outside the building. He was taken into custody without incident and was charged with first-degree murder, aggravated assault, shooting into an occupied vehicle, and being a felon in possession of a firearm. And in the end, Gibson was sentenced on all counts and was sentenced to life in prison. 4. Michael Pagel. Most people who knew 41-year-old Renee Pagel thought of her as one of the kindest people they'd ever met. Known for her giving nature, the recently divorced mother of 3 from Rockford, Michigan even donated her kidney to the father of one of her nursing students, a man she barely knew in 2006. But no human being is universally liked, and Renee was no exception. Just days after the kidney operation, Renee's parents found her dead in her bedroom. They quickly realized that there was too much blood, and her injuries were too severe for her death to be the result of post-surgery complications. Someone had stabbed Renee dozens of times in the face, head, and torso in an apparent rage before fleeing the scene with the murder weapon. Several persons of interest were quickly ruled out, including Renee's brother-in-law Charles Pagel and a tenant who rented an apartment above her horse barn. Authorities soon turned their attention toward her ex-husband Michael Pagel, who'd recently come out on the losing end of an acrimonious divorce. During the couple's marriage, Renee was the breadwinner and Michael was a stay-at-home dad. When the pair split, Michael expected to win primary custody of the kids and to receive alimony payments. He also wanted the house. But in the eyes of the judge, there was no reason for Michael not to get a job. So he awarded the house and primary custody of the kids to Renee and ordered Michael to pay alimony. Michael was enraged by the ruling, which came just weeks before Renee's murder. He certainly had a motive to kill his ex-wife, and he acted suspicious right off the bat by refusing to speak to detectives and referring them to his lawyer. Investigators lacked enough evidence to charge him with the crime, and the case remained unsolved for the next 13 years. A break finally came in 2019 though, when Michael's brother Charles contacted Renee's friend Chris Crandall, who was leading a renewed effort to gather information on the case. He said that the people who suspected Michael of killing Renee were right about what kind of person he was. Without going into much detail, Charles claimed that his brother had gone crazy and expressed fear that he'd be the next victim. But when Crandall pushed him for details about the murder, he claimed he didn't know anything. Charles eventually told police 5 years after Renee's death that Michael had shown him the murder weapon and had said he'd used it to finalize his divorce in 2011. He threw the blade into a nearby river, where it remained until Charles revealed its location to investigators. When asked why he didn't come forward earlier, he claimed that Michael had threatened to kill him if he told anyone what he knew. Armed with new evidence, prosecutors were finally able to charge Michael in 2020. And after realizing how high the deck was stacked against him, he pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a 25 to 50-year sentence. He apologized for his actions in court, yet he passed the buck by accusing Charles of helping to plot the crime and of being the actual killer. But authorities never found any evidence to suggest that this was the case. They continued to believe that Michael acted alone in a fit of rage when he could no longer contain his anger at Renee over the outcome of the divorce. 3. John Hamilton. 52-year-old John Hamilton was a well-known doctor in Oklahoma City with a reputation for being calm and mild-mannered. He was also romantic and generous, perhaps to a fault, and showed his love for his wife Susan by spoiling her with expensive gifts and vacations. The couple tied the knot in 1987 and were married for 14 years. And from the outside looking in, they seemed to have the kind of relationship most people hope for. That all changed though on Valentine's Day in 2001, when John dialed 911 and reported that he'd discovered Susan dead in a pool of blood when he stomped home during a work break. Susan had been strangled with 2 neckties and bludgeoned in the head with such force that her brain matter was exposed. John was hysterical and covered in blood when police arrived. He seemed genuinely distraught, but his story didn't add up. He said he'd tried performing mouth-to-mouth on Susan, but there was no blood on his face. He suggested that Susan had been targeted by anti-abortion activists who were known to picket outside his office, but it seemed unlikely to investigators. There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing appeared to be stolen. Detectives also noticed a distinct lack of bloody footprints, which was unusual given Susan's manner of death. While processing the scene, police found the Valentine's Day card that Susan had given John that day. The note written inside hinted toward problems in the marriage, stating, "I bought this 2 weeks ago, so I guess maybe it doesn't seem as appropriate, but I do love you. Have a good day, Susan." According to a friend, Susan had recently discovered some suspicious calls John had made to a stripper. John tried claiming that the young woman was just a patient who'd reached out to him personally for help. But Susan didn't buy it, and she believed John was having an affair. The couple had also recently argued over money. While en route to the police station for questioning, officers noticed that John was rubbing his hands against the squad car's mesh divider, leading them to wonder if he was trying to conceal injuries he'd sustained while attacking his wife. An overview of his movements revealed that he was late for his second scheduled operation of the day, creating a big enough window of time for him to have committed the crime. Authorities charged John with Susan's murder, but he received widespread public support even as the dirty laundry about his suspicious calls with the topless dancer were revealed. Many people struggled to see John as anything other than a pillar of the community, and while they were quick to admit he overstepped his professional boundaries with the stripper, his supporters refused to believe he was capable of murder. In fact, the alleged mistress became a convenient scapegoat for many who didn't want to face the reality that the beloved doctor was a cold-blooded wife killer. Prosecutors accused John of losing his temper and killing Susan during an argument, leaving the house to perform a surgery and returning home afterward to discover the murder scene. The most convincing testimony came from a blood spatter expert, who explained how marks on John's shirt were indicative of a beating in progress rather than someone tending to a victim after an attack. And after deliberating for just 2 hours, the jury found John guilty of Susan's murder. He was sentenced to life without parole and remained behind bars after appealing his case multiple times. 2. David Anthony Burns. 19-year-old Courtney Coco was last seen alive at her family's home in Alexandria, Louisiana in October 2004. 3 days later, her remains were found in an abandoned building nearly 200 miles away in Winnie, Texas. Her cause of death was unclear due to the heavily decomposed state of her body, but the circumstances of the case were enough to rule the manner of death as a homicide. Courtney had no known ties to anyone in Winnie, and the handful of people who initially fell under law enforcement's radar were ultimately cleared of any involvement in the young woman's murder. Investigators hoped for a break in the case when they located Courtney's car in Houston, but the people in possession of the vehicle were also released without charges. DNA analysis of blood found in the trunk turned up as a match to Courtney, indicating that the killer had used her car to transport her dead body. But authorities were never able to figure out how the vehicle ended up in the possession of the people who were caught driving it. The case quickly became a whodunit, and over time detectives began to wonder if Courtney had been killed by a complete stranger. But in 2011, several witnesses came forward, claiming that David Anthony Burns, the former fiancé of Courtney's older sister Lace Evans, had confessed to smothering Courtney to death with a pillow. But there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, and the investigation once again hit a standstill. Police finally arrested Burns in 2021, more than 16 years after the murder, following a renewed effort to solve the case and the discovery of a key witness who was able to place him at the scene where Courtney's body was dumped. According to prosecutors, Courtney was secretly seeing Burns romantically, even though he was engaged to her sister. On the night of her death, she was home alone watching her family's dogs while they were out of town. Courtney had recently received a large inheritance, and the crime scene showed signs of a burglary. And according to witnesses, Burns had admitted to having financial motives. But some people speculated that the murder was the product of more than just a burglary, and that something went terribly wrong between Courtney and Burns that night. While prosecutors never speculated that Burns was afraid Courtney would expose their affair, the very nature of their relationship makes it hard not to wonder if this was a factor. Burns maintained his innocence throughout his trial, but failed to sway the jury in his favor. And in the end, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. 1. George Stephen Birch. During what was supposed to be a fun night out with friends in Green Bay, Wisconsin in 2016, 31-year-old mother of three, Nicole Vander Hayden, got into a heated argument with her boyfriend and the father of her youngest child, 35-year-old Douglas Dentry. She left for another bar without Dentry and was still out when he arrived at the couple's home later that night. Dentry initially assumed that Nicole had spent the night at a friend's house, but when she failed to return home the next morning, he reported her missing. Immediately suspicious of Dentry, police questioned why he waited so long to report Nicole's disappearance. That same day, her body was found in a field just 3 miles from where the couple lived. Nicole's remains had been beaten and strangled to death in a manner so brutal that it shocked even the most seasoned detectives on the case. Meanwhile, the more detectives learned about Dentry's relationship with Nicole and the events leading up to her murder, the more convinced they became that Dentry was the killer. People who knew the couple described a relationship that seemed perfect at first. Over time, however, they began to have issues. In a recent text message to a friend, Dentry had mentioned that he was considering ending the relationship and asking Nicole and her kids to move out. And after storming off the night before, Nicole had sent Dentry a slew of text messages accusing him of being an abusive cheater. At one point, she tried calling him and he didn't pick up. But he answered the phone when Nicole called from a friend's phone, which only further fueled her anger. Nicole left the bar upset and was last seen walking down the streets into the darkness. Following the discovery of her body and several of her belongings that were found scattered throughout the area, police managed to obtain a male DNA profile from the evidence. Confident that Dentry would be a match, they arrested him and held him in custody while awaiting the results. But not only was Dentry not a match, items from his house that were initially taken as evidence ultimately proved to have no connection to Nicole's murder. His Fitbit data further showed that he only took 12 steps in the window of time during which the crime was committed, and as a result, Dentry was eliminated as a suspect and released from jail. The DNA implicated a 40-year-old man from Virginia named George Stephen Birch, who initially claimed that it hooked up with Nicole in his vehicle after giving her a ride home. He said it happened in her driveway, which sounded extremely unlike Nicole to anyone who knew her. She wasn't the type to cheat on her boyfriend or to have a casual encounter, and she was far out of Birch's league as far as looks went. Birch changed his story though when cell phone data put him in the scene where Nicole's body was dumped. He then claimed the Detry came outside and killed Nicole right in front of him after catching them in the act. Birch accused Detry of forcing him to dispose of Nicole's body at gunpoint and said he complied because he was afraid for his life. Prosecutors, however, claimed that Birch flew into a rage and murdered Nicole with his bare hands when she resisted his advances. He then dumped her body and threw her belongings out his car window as he drove away. George Stephen Birch was convicted of murder and was sentenced to life without parole. He continues to challenge his case from behind bars, hoping he'll eventually win back his freedom on a legal technicality or convince a court to believe his ridiculous version of events. If you witnessed a shooting taking place between police officers and a suspected criminal, and you had a gun on you at the time, would you attempt to help the officers? Or would you run away from the situation and let the professionals handle it? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!